Now we have another method which is total incorrect, which is basically the opposite of total correct here. The opposite. So I'm going to make a copy of it, paste it right. Let's see. Actually, right under total correct. Oopsie. Hold on 1 second. Let me just indent it as well. Okay. So let's call it total incorrect. That's how I said we call it, right? Yeah, total incorrect. And let's change it. And so incorrect answers. Let's name this incorrect answers is equal to 0, right? We're going through the array. If at any time the correct answer is that particular correct answer is, now this is checking to see if it's equal, right? And so the way we say is not equal is we wrap a parentheses around all of this whole statement, and we put an exclamation sign in front of it, meaning that if this statement is not true, right? Hold on 1 second. Yeah, meaning if the statement is not true. Okay, so over here we're checking to see if this is true, if these match. But over here we are putting an exclamation sign, and outside, basically we are surrounding the whole thing with parentheses and putting an exclamation sign, meaning that if it's not true, if that whole statement is not true, right? If it's not true, then let's add 1 to incorrect answers, right? So if there's no match, then let's keep track of the number of times they got wrong. So incorrect answers it's going to be equal to what's already stored in incorrect answers plus 1. And then when you're done, return incorrect answers. So we're done with this method also. Okay. The next one is going to be questions missed, and this is basically returning. It's returning an integer array containing the question numbers. The question numbers of the questions that the student missed. And so we're going to use the logic from the total incorrect to work with this, right? Because based on the total incorrect, we would know the particular index we are working with, right? And be able to return, the index, or basically the question number. And so let's create, let's create an instance method called questions missed. And questions missed is going to, we know that it's going to return an int array, right? And so let's set the return type to be an integer array. So an integer array, it's going to return that integer array. And now let's give it a name, which is questions missed. And so public integer array questions missed, right? Okay, so how do we determine the questions missed, right? Let's use the same loop over here. I'm going to copy in total incorrect. Same loop, same idea. We're going through the loop. If at any time we realize that there is no match, okay, exclamation sign, there is no match, then we know that that question is incorrect. That particular question, we are using that index to refer to that. Basically, we know what index. So if the index is 0, we know we are referring to this, right? But this is, so if the index is 0, we are actually referring to the first question. If the index is 1, we are referring to the second question. If the index is 19, we know we are referring to the 20th question. So it's always plus 1. If the index is, let's say, 2, 0, 1, 2, which is this one, then we're referring to the third question, right? So remember, the indices start from 0, but then the numbering of the elements actually they are basically from 1, 2, right? But the index or the indices of these elements start numbering from 0. Okay, so if there's no match, we know the particular index we're working with. But then it's always plus 1, because if we're dealing with the first, if you're dealing with, let's say, index 0, all right, we're actually dealing with the first question. So 0, first question. If you're dealing with index 1, okay, it's the index 1, right? But we're dealing with the second question, so it's always plus 1. And so if that's the case, let's remove this. If we know that they didn't have a match here, like the answers didn't match or they don't match, then what we should do is, before we do anything, let's create an array in this method, because we're going to return an integer array. And so let's create an integer array which is going to store the questions missed, basically the numbers of the questions missed. And so I'm going to create an integer array here, and I'm going to call it questions I don't want to name it the same as this. I'm going to name it questions missed array, right? And I'm going to initialize it to the size. So basically, I'm going to create a new. So this is basically a variable that's going to hold. It's a reference variable that's going to hold an integer array. Now I'm creating the array, okay, in memory. And so I'm creating a new integer array, and I'm setting the size to the number of questions we had stored here, right? Where is it? Yeah. So I'm setting the size to the number of questions here. That's what I'm doing. By default, when you do that, it sets each slot to 0. Each element becomes 0. You know, before you store anything in there, each slot becomes 0, right? Until you override it. And so just keep note of that. You'll see that later on. And so if at any time there's no match, we know the index. And so in the questions missed array, in that particular index, okay, in that particular index, in the very, for example, in the index, let's see. Okay, so we may have a problem here because it's possible that, let's see. Because this is an if statement, so right? So it's possible that we'll be storing. It's possible we'll be storing. But we can still work with it, right? We can still work with it, but I don't want to confuse. Actually, all right. So we should do this because this is an if statement. We wouldn't have index. It's possible that we'll be storing the correct answers in a different slot, assuming that there is no match at, let's say, question 1, 2, 3, 4. Question 4. That means index at that point will be 3 because this fourth element will have an index of 3, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, and so in that case, then it's going to store something in, let's say, the third slot of question. I don't want that. I want everything to be in order, right? And so let's create an index for the questions missed array, right? So it's just going to be an index. I'm going to call it questions missed array index. It's just going to be an index. I know it's long, but it's fine. And I'm going to set it equal to 0. And so that's the index we're going to use actually to set a value in questions missed array. And so if at any time, right? If at any time we don't find a match, that means we have a wrong answer. So in the questions missed index, right? Let's set it equal to the question number. If we're dealing with the index, let's say 0, like I said, then we're dealing with question 1. It's always plus 1. It's always the index plus 1. And so in that case, we set it equal to the particular index we are working with plus 1. Okay, we are storing the question number, right? So if the index is 0, if this element, we are dealing with this element, we're actually dealing with the question 1. And so we always add 1 to the index, so we actually store the question number in the array, in my semicolon. And then we have to increase the question missed index, the question missed array index by 1. Okay, plus is the same as, you know, basically something like this, right? We are increasing the question missed array index plus by 1. So that if we are going to write something into question missed array again, we are writing it in slot, in index, using index 1, okay, meaning the next slot. And then we increase the question missed array index by 1, which then it becomes 2. So if it happens that we are going to write something in the questions missed array, again, we are using index 2. We are writing it in the next slot, right? And so that's why we have to increase question missed index. Otherwise, we'll be sticking with one index, and we'll be writing different values in the same slot, overwriting the old values. That's not what we want. So always make sure you increase question missed array index by 1. Okay, and so by the time this is done, we'll have this array, question missed array, populated. And so when we are done with the loop, what we are going to do is just return that array. Return questions missed array. Right? We said we were going to return an integer array, and questions missed array is an integer array. And so return questions missed array when you're done. Okay, and so now we're done with all the methods. Now let's go ahead and define or create the constructor, right? And so right after this method, let's go ahead and create the constructor. Now the constructor is just like a regular method. It doesn't have a return type, and it doesn't have a keyword static also. It doesn't have a return type because we are not the ones who call this method. We don't call this method ourselves. This method is called when someone tries to create an object from this class, when code outside of this class tries to create an object from this class. So because we don't call it ourselves, it can't return a value, or it can't return a value, and so we don't specify a return type. So it's just the access specifier, which is in this case is going to be public because we want code outside of this class to be able to use this constructor to create objects from this class, right? And so we set it to public, and it's just the name of the constructor. No keyword static, no static keyword, and then no return type. Then the name of the constructor. Now the name of the constructor has to be the same as the name of the class. In this case, our class is called DriverExam, and so the constructor has to be called DriverExam. And then it looks just like a regular method apart from after that. Now I'm going to define this constructor. Remember that our student answers, right, is not defined. I mean, it's not initialized yet, right? But so I'm going to define this constructor in such a way that it's going to accept in an array from the main method or the main program already filled, so that we can basically store that array, or basically store the memory address of that array in student answers. So we can have a copy of, we can have not a copy of it per se, but we can refer to that array. This, if we accept in over here and the student array already filled with answers, we can store it in the student answers here, so that this student answers variable can refer to the array that was passed from main, or from the main program. And so I'm going to define the DriverExam constructor in such a way that it's going to accept in a string array, okay, a string array. And so I'm going to define a string array as a parameter here, and I'm going to call it student array given. That's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it student array given. And once we have the student array given, I'm just going to set our student answers array that we have in our class. I'm going to set it equal to the student array given, and that's going to basically store the memory address of the array that was given into student answers. And so that means student answers will now refer to the array that was given to us, and so we can work with it in our program here. Okay, and so once we have that, let's see what else. It looks like we are done with this class. It looks like it. If anything, we'll come back to it. Yeah, so let's compile this, and I'm going to basically create a new folder in chapter 7, and I'm going to call it what's this called? Driver's license exam. Let's see. Okay, and so I'll create a new folder for the 6th question, I believe. Yeah, driver's license exam, and I'll save this class in. This is the class. Save it in here as driver exam, right? All right, we have a couple of errors, so let's fix it. Required but int found. Let's see. Array required but int found. Correct answers. Correct. Okay, so what the problem is this. Now I've defined over here an integer. I defined it as correct answers. I set it to 0. Now I also have an array called correct answers. So this program is confusing. I'm trying to refer to the array over here, right? But it's confusing it as this. It's saying that, hey, this is defined as an integer, but if you want to use an array, then make sure you use an array, right? It doesn't know the difference. It thinks that I'm trying to use this integer variable here, and it's telling me that when I compile this, telling me that an array is what is required here. It looks like you're trying to use an array because you have an index for it, but int is what is found here. It found this. It's confusing. It's not knowing to choose. It's not knowing to choose this. And so let's change the name of this to, let's say, total correct answers. And once we are done over here, let's return. Actually, over here it's going to be the same. Total correct answers. Right. Let's just copy this. Total correct answers is going to be equal to total correct answers plus 1, and then when you're done, return total correct answers. All right. So now I think you should be fine. Compile this, and we're fine. Okay. And so I have saved this DriverExam class in a folder. So I'm going to create a new program, right? And as long as I save it in the same folder, they should be able to see each other, right? If you don't save the class in the same folder as the program, then you'd have to specify to the program where the class is. Otherwise you're going to have errors. But if you put them in the same folder, then you won't have a problem because they're in the same folder and they should be able to access each other, right? Sorry, I'm talking a bit fast, I think. I'll try to slow down. Sometimes I get excited with these programs, so I talk fast, I think. If it's fine, then that's good. All right, so I'm going to create a new program. Let me make a copy of this question so I have it there. And I'll paste it here. And so now I'm going to create the class, and I'll call this DriverExam test. And so I'll go ahead and I'll create a main method, public static, void main. My typing is really bad. Okay. Now the main method. All right, so let's see. We're going to use a scanner to ask the user for input, right? So since we're going to use a scanner, let's import the scanner class so this program can have access to it. So import java.util.scanner. We are importing the scanner class located in the java.util package in the Java API. And so let's see. Demonstrate the class in a complete program that asks the user to enter a student's answers and then displays the results returned from the DriverExam class methods. All right. And so it seems like we're going to ask the user, right, to enter answers, right, and that's what we're going to store in an array. And so in the main method, let's first go ahead and define an array. Okay, an array that we're going to pass into this class, right? So it's going to be a string array. Let's call it student answers. It doesn't matter if it's the same as what's here. There are two different. The scope of this array we are going to create, student answers, is within this main method, right? And what we have here, the student answers, is also within the class, and so they don't see each other, right? So string student answers is going to be equal to, before that we need to set a size or how many questions, right? So let's do that here too. Int number of questions. Let's set it equal to, actually let's make it the final variable, right? So let's create final int, and let's call it number of questions. But if it's a final variable, then let's use capital letters, right? Convention. And so number of questions. All right, let's set it equal to 20. And so a string array called student answers is going to be equal to a new string array, and let's set the size, semicolon, set aside to number of questions here. Okay, now we have the array. Now let's create a method over here that when we pass this array to, we'll basically ask the user to type in the answers, and then it'll fill this array. And so let's create a public. Now we are basically in our program itself. So let's create a public static. Let's see. It's going to be a void. It's not going to return anything. All we are doing is we're going to fill this array with the student's answers, right? And so we're not going to return anything. So I'm going to set a return type to void. So public static void, and I'm going to call this method, let's see, I'm going to call it fill student array, student answers array. It's a long name, but again, it's fine. I like long names. I'm sure most of you know by now. But if you want something short, please feel free. So let's call it fill student answers array, and it's going to need an array, right? So I'm going to define. It's going to need a string array. I'm going to define a string array, and I'm going to call it. I'm going to say that this method is going to need an array. So I'm going to. It doesn't matter if I call it the same name as this. This is just a parameter name to refer to the array that's going to be passed here. It's a placeholder. I'm just giving it a name. Doesn't matter if I give it the same name as this. Again, the scope of the variable I'm about to declare here is within the fill student answers array, and the scope of this is within the main method, right? So it's going to accept in an array. I'm going to call it student answers, and what we're going to do is I'm basically going to create a scanner object, right? Since we're going to use a scanner, I'm going to create a scanner object. So scanner, I'm going to call it keyboard. It's going to be equal to a new scanner. I'm going to pass in system.in to refer to the keyboard. That's the source. The source is from the keyboard, and I'm calling it keyboard. And so once I have this scanner, I can use it. I can create basically a system.out. Well, before that. Okay, so we know that the student answers already already have a length, right? And so let's create the same idea. Let's create a loop to go through that array, starting from the first element, and fill it up with values. So remember, this kind of loop was what we were using to go through the arrays, right? So we're going to do the same thing. Let's create a for loop that's going to go through this array and fill it, starting from the first slot to the last slot. And so let's create a for loop. We are going to use index to refer to the index, the current location, the current index. So for int index is going to be equal to 0, very similar to the last one. As long as the index is less than, now we have this array here, which is student answers dot length. Do what's in the loop, and before you come back up to check to see if index is less than student answers dot length, right, add 1 to index. We're going through, we're making sure that index is starting from 0, right, because the index starts from 0, and making sure that it's a valid index. If it's anywhere from 0 to 1 less than the length of the array that was passed to this method, then we're fine. Add 1 to index and then keep on checking. So we are basically going through from the first slot of the array that was given to us to the last slot of the array, right? Okay, so each iteration we want to ask the user, let's see, system.out.println. We want to ask the user, let's say, please, or let's say, what's the answer? Let's say answer for question. And we can actually, since index is starting from 0, index 0 actually means, right? Index 0 actually means question 1, right? Index 1 actually means question 2. Index 2 actually means question 3. And so we can use the index to actually can display the index. But remember, index 0 means question 1, index 1 means question 2, and so on and so forth. And so let's add 1 to the index so it displays well. If we're in the first index, then let's add 1 to it. So it says answer for question index plus 1. If we're in the first index, which has an index of 0, we're actually referring to the first question, right? Index 0 referring to the first question. And so if it's 0, then add 1 to it so it displays answer for question 1. If it's 1, then display answer for question 2. If index is 2, then we are actually index is 2, 0, 1, 2. We're actually dealing with a third question, and so display answer for question 3. All right, so that's what we're doing here. You can, if you want, you can surround it with parentheses just so it's clear, like that. All right, so once we do that, we want to basically get a response, right? Let's create a string variable because we have some input validation here, right? So let's create a string variable to get the response. I'm going to actually call it users or user response. All right, and then I'm going to now call use a scanner to call keyboard.next line, right? Since the user is going to type in a string. Now keyboard.next line is going to basically pop up some kind of text box and allow the user to type in something. Now whatever the user types is going to be returned as a string, right? And so when it's returned as a string, we have the variable user response here to store it. And so user response is going to be equal to whatever the user types. And then once we have user response, what we want to do is we want to store it in the students array in that particular index, right? Because index is keeping track of that particular index, starting from 0 all the way to the last one, right? All the way to the last index. So based on the index, we are storing the user's response in that particular slot, and then the loop iterates again, asks for the second question. Remember, index will be increased. So based on the index, we are storing whatever value the user types in that particular index slot in an array.